Good afternoon and welcome to NQA's webinar today, which will be on meeting the COVID manufacturing challenge. Just a few housekeeping things to begin with. Everyone's on mute. There is an option for asking questions, which you'll see in the side panel. If you do have some questions, feel free to make a note of them. We'll try and answer them during the webinar. If we don't get enough time, then we can save them up for later, and maybe we can email you afterwards. Just to let you know, there's myself, Michael Venner. I'll be presenting the webinar, but we also have Tam Roll, who's one of our regional assessors that specialises in the medical sector. So they'll be able to give some technical input also at a later date. So.
Hello, that's me. Thank you for having me along.
Okay, thanks, Tam. I'll start off the webinar, and then Tam will probably take over a little bit more technically a little bit later on. Okay. So everybody knows what's going on at the moment with the COVID-19 outbreak. Little bit of background. I know, as we all know everything anyway, but on the 16th of March 2020, the Prime Minister asked for companies around the country to help manufacture, design and build various things that the NHS are going to need, such as ventilators, masks, gowns, gloves and everything like that. Now, a lot of organisations are on furlough at the moment, a lot of their employees, but there is still a lot of manufacturing going on. And what a lot of organisations have done, they've switched over to what they're normally doing and changed over to trying to support the government. Now, unfortunately, there's been a lot of bad press about this in the news, where the government has declined a lot of support, but there's very good reasons behind that. And that's a lot of what this webinar is going to do. It's going to go into a bit of detail on some of the things that you need to do in order to support the government, some of the reasons why they haven't taken everyone up on the offer. There are sort of technicalities behind it. They haven't just bluntly refused everybody. So we're going to go into that a little bit more detail. So if you are looking at supporting the government through this endeavour, then this webinar should give you some tips on that, what you need to do for your management system, what you need to do to apply, and how you need to control that at the moment. Okay, there was apparently 5,000 offers of support for, to support the government through this endeavour, which was quite a lot. So it's nice to see. There's a big challenge operating on a number of fronts, including the manufacturing of existing ventilators. There's a lot of manufacturing organisations that are teaming up with the sort of small organisations, and the large ones are teaming up to kind of build these bespoke ventilators. We've already seen in the news about Dyson, McLaren, Rolls-Royce are jumping on board. So there's a lot of large manufacturing organisations taking control of this, that understand the technicalities and the criticality of manufacturing, and they're utilising a lot of the smaller suppliers to help support the flow of sort of the parts. So it's generally the bigger ones that are doing the design aspect and things like that. On the 13th of March, Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, which is the MHRA, they published a specification with subsequent revisions on the minimum clinical standards acceptable for the ventilator use in UK hospitals. They've had to redesign some of the rules very, very rapidly to allow sort of the ventilators and other medical equipment to get into the industry very, very quickly. They've had to sort of rewrite certain things and relax certain rules just for this temporary basis, but they're still expecting certain controls to be in place for this, which we'll go into in a bit more detail. So just a little disclaimer, information here does not constitute professional advice, and any organisation providing services in the medical sector has its own responsibility for complying with the relevant regulations and requirements for the product or service that you are providing. So it's very important, and it comes out actually in this webinar, that if you are looking at going down this route and supporting the UK government, that you need to actually communicate with the regulators. You need to put an application telling them what you're going to do, what you plan on doing, but you need to keep regular communication with them, and they will help guide you through this process. They'll help identify all the legislation that's applicable to you and things like that. So don't sit at home and start making things yourself expecting the UK government to accept them, because they just won't do it. They got, obviously it's important that they get PPE and ventilators and things put through the system. However, that could cause more damage sometimes when they're putting things on that aren't safe to use. So make sure you're verifying what you're doing beforehand. So first of all, we'll start off going to some key considerations when you're providing components or products to the medical sector. We'll give you a little bit of background on this. So this is the regulatory framework that you need to be aware of. This is generalized, but it's also key specific things that you need to be aware of when going down, embarking this COVID-19 route. This covers sort of ventilators, but also a lot more of the PPE. So we're going to focus on sort of mostly around the PPE, because the ventilators are being done by the large organizations. So we're just going to highlight some of the manufacturing techniques that you need to do to support that, but also the PPE, which we see sort of coming up on the internet quite a bit nowadays, a lot on LinkedIn, where people are switching their machines over. So the regulatory framework, it's very important to understand what it is. So there's 4 key things to think about. There's the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, which is the MHRA. They're kind of an agency that oversees everything that happens in the UK. They look after various things such as clinical trials, inspections, good practices, but they're the ones that have also released the rules on what we can do and can't do at the moment to get everything into the hospitals and into the NHS. So the rules are being rewritten by this agency. CE marking, everyone probably aware of CE marking. There's various rules underlying the procedure to affix CE marking and things like that. CE marking covers a broad range of products throughout the European Economic Area. Machines, toys, it covers lots and lots of things. You'll probably see CE marking on various products that you have around your house. So a lot of medical products will fall under the CE marking requirements. Not everything does. Some CE marking is self-declaration, and then others are through notified bodies. And it all depends on what the product is that you're providing, on what way it goes. So you need to read the actual directive information that tells you whether you can self-declare, or you have to go through a third party, which would be a notified body, which are controlled under various regulators. So it's important to understand the directive to know what process you have to go through if you need to get products approved. So even if you are self-declaring, you still need to meet the health and safety requirements for those products. Just because you're self-declaring doesn't mean you don't need to do anything. Notified bodies will verify and validate that what you're doing does meet the legal requirements from a health and safety perspective, but self-declaring still does the same process, but you're basically declaring that it meets requirements yourself. And we'll come on to that a little bit shortly. Third thing is the Medical Device Directive. So this is the directive that will go into the CE marking for the medical products that we have at the moment. It's a harmonised law that takes all medical devices across the European Union to make sure they meet requirements, and it puts certain things in there. There'll be pressures, electronic currents, all things like that put it all together into one directive. Now the CE marking process will validate that what you have done under the directive meets the requirements. So it's important that you're aware of the Medical Device Directive. Not everything that we talk about is going to fall under that. They're actually going through change with the Medical Device Directive, as you can see there. It's coming into effect 26th of May. They're revising it, repealing it, and generally just updating it to meet more current legislation. And then we come down to the PPE directive. So there's three categories for this, but a lot of the products that you're seeing, such as the masks, they'll come under category 3 of this directive. Again, if you need to look at the full directive to understand what the products are and where they fall into. I believe it's something like 80% of all products under the PPE fall under the category 3, I believe. Yeah, or category 2. No, sorry, category 2. Yes, about 80% of all products fall into that. There are, under the medical directive, there are many other standards that support it. Just for example, BSEN 794 is requirements for emergency transport ventilators. 10651 is for lung ventilators. So the medical directive is an overarching standard, and then you get all the other legislation underneath it. So it's important to understand what you're manufacturing to identify all the legislation that comes under it. So there's two key programs in place at the moment. There is the rapidly manufactured ventilator systems. That is the ventilators that you're seeing being put into the hospitals. Those are things such as McLaren, Dyson have produced. And a lot of the lower level manufacturing organisations are supporting the components and parts on that. The designs are all pretty much done now, although that was part of the initial rollout from the government. They needed people to design them. I think that's kind of done now. So it's a point of just getting the ventilators through the system. So you may be still supporting those. You may not be into supporting the ventilators at the moment, maybe something you're looking at. You need to speak to the bigger manufacturers and see if they need any additional suppliers. Either way, a lot of what we're going to cover today is important information to be able to manufacture those components. You may not worry as much about the CE process and things like that, but you need to ensure your manufacturing techniques are up to the requirements. So the ventilators themselves, they won't be CE marked. Okay, it's going to take too long to get through to do a formal CE marking process. They have to go through lots of tests and things like that. So the MHRA have said we don't need to get them approved. Now, they're still putting guidance on what these ventilators need to achieve in terms of pressures and everything like that, but they're not going through a formal CE marking. There's an additional form that has to be filled in to get to bypass that, which is part of the application process to get the ventilators approved. So although it doesn't go through CE marking, there's still a separate application that has to go in just to explain what you've done, how you've done it, and how it could be approved. The other side of it, which we see a lot in the news, is the PPE. There's just an example of some of the PPE over there. Mostly the masks. Now the masks fall into two different categories. They're either general masks for non-surgical, or they are surgical. So if they're surgical masks, they must fall under the CE marking, must fall under the directive. If they're just general masks and not surgical, they can then fall under the PPE directive, which we'll go into in a bit more detail. Then we have gowns and aprons, eye protection, there's hand wash, sanitizers, gloves. They've all got to fall under the PPE directive. And this is why people at home that started making their own gowns, they're just using whatever products they can find, any material, they're actually not suitable. For example, are they being flam tested? Are they the right material that allows for sterile environments and things like that? So this is why the government has had to sort of push back on a lot of offers, is because they don't know what materials were used, they weren't traceable, they cannot chance that risk. So they've had to decline everything, which is why they're importing everything because there are no manufacturers in the world that can actually meet the standards of the PPE directive. So if you are thinking about doing it, it's still important to understand the health and safety requirements related to the products that you're going to make. They're all laid out in the PPE directive, so you need to get a copy of that. Just as an example, the EN 149 is for masks, for the non-surgical masks, and EN 14683 is for surgical masks. So you need to still get hold of those standards to understand what's in them and see what materials you can use and things like that. The standards are currently being made available free of charge to anyone that needs them. You can get them through the government website. They'll lead you on to somewhere else to actually download them. But unusually, they're being opened up free, where normally you have to pay for them, just to allow you to understand what's got to be met in terms of these standards. So the big challenge, there's a significant demand for certain medical products and services, which is highlighted. The government is waiting to import products from outside of the UK. That's purely because we haven't got enough sources within the UK to make them internally. It's just a fact of the UK economy. Just something history, we have to import everything, where before it's not been a problem, but obviously as there's a huge demand in need for all the products, every country's going to the same people to see what they can get. So unfortunately, some of us are at the back of the line, and that's just one of the things we have to do. So if there are any companies within the UK that can support that, then it's great. You just need to understand the rules around the products in order to satisfy the government requirements. People are just making anything without understanding the regulations and requirements for manufacturing controls. So we've seen quite a bit on the news. I've heard apparently Denise Van Houten was making things in her living room out of, I don't know what it was, apparently, and trying to offer it. All very, very kind of people to do that, but they still need to meet the PPE requirements. Some items will have to be CE marked, as I say. The UK government is allowing you to make certain things that should necessarily or technically be under the CE marking requirements, but you can do it without CE marking as long as you supply it directly to the NHS and it doesn't get sold on afterwards to anyone else. So you can make them directly for the UK government, directly for the NHS, but you cannot sell them on to anyone else. So just for example, if you were making masks and you thought, here's a new avenue for my business, I'll sell them on to the NHS, then afterwards I'll sell them on to general public. You can't do that because they haven't been tested to ensure they meet the PPE requirements. There's certain things like that, but the UK government has said they'll accept certain products without being CE marked as long as it just flows into them only. Again, it's all on the application forms that you have to fill in when you're putting something through. Sorry. And the last bit is manufacturing techniques may not be up to the quality system requirements and expectations. So there's a medical devices ISO standard, which is 13485, which is something we offer as a certification body. We have many clients that are certified under this, and a lot of organizations expect manufacturers to be certified to 13485 if you're in the medical sector. It's quite a popular standard, different locations throughout the world. And there's certain requirements within that standard that these like the high-end manufacturers and the government are expecting you to meet. But these are the things that we're going to highlight within this webinar to show you what you need to do with your management system to bring it up to scratch. So you may have ISO 9001 as an example. 13485 builds on that and it puts additional requirements in place. So it's important that you understand what those are, and then you can put those in place, ensure your management system's more robust, and then that will just make the process of getting your products to the UK government a lot easier. There's other organisations that may be aerospace certified, AS9100. The transition between AS9100 and 13485 is not too difficult. They're very, very similar standards. There's certain things within the medical devices standard which isn't in the AS 9100 standard, but the majority is exactly the same. So those organisations will find a smoother transition if they wish to do that. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight this, which I briefly mentioned earlier. If you are placing products on the market, this is surgical, medical masks and things like that. This is where the government is saying you can sell directly to the UK government to be used during the COVID-19 outbreak, but then nothing else can happen with those. They don't need to get certified, but you cannot place them on the market. So it all depends on why you're producing these masks or gloves or products, whatever you're doing. If you're just doing it to support COVID-19 and selling it direct for this purpose, then the government has relaxed a lot of the rules and you're not required to get testing and things like that put in place. But if you are intending to afterwards put it onto the market as a wider product, then you do need to ensure that you follow the CE marking regulations and things like that and get them approved. So just want to highlight this, false claims. So if you claim that your product is suitable and it is CE marked, so you can't just go along putting a CE mark on your products and saying, yes, it's CE marked. There's a whole big documentation that follows it and tests that have to go through and things like that. So CE marking is a whole big directive, as pointed out earlier. If you falsely claim that, there is large penalties. You could go to prison. Trading standards gets involved. So it's very important that you're aware of these implications if you start to make products and you intend to sell them to the wider market. You can get in a lot of trouble with this. So just wanted to highlight that. And there's a government website down there if you wanted to look into it a little bit further. The information's out there if you look in the right places. So it's not overly complicated. There's just a lot of reading to understand what the rules are and regulations, things like that. So just be careful what you're claiming when you're out there. So now we'll go into a little bit more detail on the manufacturing controls, mostly surrounding ISO 13485, and it's the type of things that the UK government are expecting you to have in place to support this process. So I'll hand you over to Tam, who will be able to take you through a lot of this.
Hello. So, thanks again for having me along, as it were. Looking at the requirements for the management system and its considerations, as Michael had explained, if you're already using aerospace standards, possibly automotive standards, some of the requirements might be quite familiar to yourselves already. Otherwise, though, if you're, for example, ISO 9001, some, depending on industry, you may still be familiar with, but others go into a bit more detail. I'll talk you through some of these as we go along, and I'll point out some of the key considerations to think about, and to a degree why these are in place, as well, to explain what that process of thinking is and why it's all there. So if we go to the next slide and look at the management system element, there's a requirement to make sure that your system is documented to the extent necessary, as per 9001. 13485 has got some specific requirements, such as having a manual. You still have to maintain a documented manual, for example. But this may not be a direct requirement in order to meet the government's requirements for this, because it's more of almost like a carryover for the standard. But the main point is that you have the requirement the required documentation to demonstrate effectiveness of the system in place as per 9. Now, there is a requirement for record retention to keep a copy of obsolete documents, at least one, for the life of the products that go out onto the marketplace. But that also extends to, for example, a documented procedure or work instruction, which then results in a record being created, where that documented instruction has to have a lifetime that is also equal to the record it's created. So, for example, if work instruction X tells you an operative to complete Form X as part of the inspection process, and then Form X has to be retained for 10 years, then the work instruction X, at least one copy of that must also be retained for 10 years. And then if it's up issued, that copy has to be stored away so that it can be called upon in 10 years if needed. As already explained, you have to make sure that you maintain communication with regulators. And if you're performing any design activity, even if it's following on from what the government is saying, this is what we want you to do, you have to make sure that there is clear design sign-off and authorization of who is responsible in order to meet the requirements. So moving on to the risk assessment. Again, ISO 9001 has had an increase in the approach to risk in terms of process and business risk overall. However, 13485 has got a lot more focus on process and product risk, and has certain requirements for it to be met. One of the standards that you can look at, which could help you with that one, is ISO 14971. The 2019 edition just recently came out, and that's the application of risk management to medical devices. If you're interested, you can have a look at that one, but basically the idea is that risk assessment for medical device purposes should include what the process risks are, which could cause non-conformity of the product as it's manufactured, and how to address that, but also how to manage any risk that the product could cause to end users. There's a degree of risk assessment involved in the specs that's the government want you to achieve in terms of the ventilators, for example. They've stated what the performance conditions need to be, but it may be beneficial to have a review of what you can see the potential risks being, and what you're doing with the products and any design elements in order to make sure that those risks are addressed early on. That kind of risk assessment needs to include things like residual risks and risks that you might have introduced as a result of introducing changes from all of that process. And wherever you do perform risk assessment, scoring a scoring system is a good practice to support that. So resources in the working environment. So you just need to make sure that there's a good documentation of the interrelation of the personnel who are involved in the quality system, particularly for the any kind of manufacture or design carried out for medical devices or similar. So you just need to make sure that there's a good, clear amount of infrastructure and amount of authority that's needed in terms of the way that the operation is performed. And thereby also make a note of who is responsible for meeting any applicable regulatory requirements, what they're going to do to meet them, who performs communications, when and why. That's always a good practice to do. And then to ensure that there's maintenance activities carried out, and where they're required to, they're documented. Again, like I said, fairly simple in practice, but difficult to get your head around perhaps at first. But the idea is just simply make sure that there's an awareness of who is needed, what kind of training that they need, what kind of awareness they have to have, what the responsibilities are, and then when it comes to equipment, just what you need to do to keep it manufactured. It's all the manufacturing equipment up to date. Anyway, that leads us on to the contamination and cleanliness control side. So depending on what it is you're making, you may need to have certified clean rooms. The ISO 14644 series of standards is the go-to one for clean rooms for medical devices. Clean rooms are graded based on their ability to, based on the amount of particles of certain sizes that are present in the clean room when it's tested, when it's operational. And depending on what level of grading you have, it may determine what kind of product you can have in there safely. It does also include some elements of guidance for how to ensure that there's a clean environment and what kind of other testing you can do, for example, for bacterial bioburden in the area. Where that's not required, it may still be required to have a generally clean environment. Where it's always a good idea to have documented requirements for cleanliness of product or the area itself and what kind of things that you will do in order to maintain that cleanliness. Where that is required, keeping records of this being achieved, for example, with daily or weekly cleaning sheets, advising who's performed what, they've left a signature, provide a good record to demonstrate that you've met requirements in order to keep the area clean in a suitable manner. Where we are performing packaging and labelling, those operations should also be controlled, because although by then the product is manufactured, there's still a risk in terms of how you're packaging it when it goes into that to the box, or however it's going to be contained, that anything that you've got onto it at that point is potentially going to stay there depending on what happens to it next. So make sure that that's all met and the labelling is all clear as to what the product is inside. Any kind of requirements for its traceability are also identified and things like that. And so as a result of the need to ensure cleanliness for anything that goes into the NHS or similar, make sure that there's documented controls and that the processes are all made quite clear and are adhered to. When you're looking at the configuration management, so that's about the elements that you need to get together to ensure that your batch records effectively and the amount of information that you can provide for audit essentially by the government if they need to is all there and all clear. So these are the sort of things to include in a good batch record. So it's more about the exact makeup of a part where there's a high level of traceability required. So you can follow it back and see, well, this batch of product has had this component in, it was done by this operator and it had this inspector who looked at it, and it was done on this line, and so on and so forth. Again, if you're already performing manufactured to aerospace requirements, a lot of this will be quite similar. The idea being that you can trace back an individual batch and see who made it and when and what material went into it and so on. So that leads me on to the traceability, which again, like I said, if you're from that background, you should be quite familiar with. But the idea is that we want to be able to trace back to see the exact makeup of the part, so we can determine, for example, if we found that there was an issue with a particular part, can we trace it back to a specific batch of material? Then we can determine what other parts are affected. Conversely, it also means that if we find that there's a problem with a specific material, we can find if there could be batches affected and so on. Batch controls will need to be in place so that we can trace where parts were shipped to and who, and where they've gone from there, so that if a recall needs to be performed, it can be performed quite suitably and quickly in order to reduce the amount of risk to patients and users. The key thing to remember is how you're going to do that. So is it by delivery notes? Is it certificates that you send with it? Are the products going to have serial numbers attached? And how can that be done while maintaining the equipment's ability to perform its task? So part of that is then for identification. Same with when it's in the production process at your site, or if it is that the equipment's being manufactured. There needs to be a method of ensuring that products are identified at different stages, and so that you make sure that it's completed process 1 but not process 2 yet, or this one's completed process 5 so it's ready to be inspected, or this product has been inspected and is okay so we're ready to ship it. Conversely, it also means you need to have a method of identifying if product is non-conforming, so ideally by segregating, but at the very least by identifying which product isn't good enough, so that it has to either be reworked or it needs to be scrapped and started again. These processes need to be very clear and almost sort of intuitive, self-identifying in a way if the product is right or not wherever possible. So it can be done with worksheets and things like that, or it can be done with labelling and so on. But there should be quite an easy way of telling the good product from bad product apart at the very least, but also all the way through the process. in terms of the materials and the purchasing process, a bit of thought needs to just come in terms of, is the applicable legislation, any applicable standards for the materials manufacture, are they being met by the material that you're having supplied in? As Michael was talking about earlier, a big issue that's come up with some of the products being offered to the NHS is that it may not always be meeting material requirements in terms of, is it flammable, is it made of a material that's suitable for the kind of cleaning processes it needs to go through, and so on. So it's important to make sure that is correctly sourced, relating to what the standard and legislation requires. Again, that can present a significant risk, and it may be that third-party certifications or proof of the product meeting its requirements is needed. So again, in aerospace, it's probably quite a familiar requirement to have to follow this through. For 9001, it depends on very much what kind of material you have. For example, if you've been working with metal and you know that you need to follow through a heat number to be able to trace back what the heat was and what material has got into it. Again, it's the same sort of idea. You want to be able to trace it back to see what exactly is in it. Inspection records for incoming goods should be maintained as part of the batch information, or where relevant, or else the batch should be able to identify what the inspection record was, so it can be found from documentation, and that should also be retained. Again, a process may be a good documented procedure. May be a good way to help control it. Records maintained and supplied for a suitable amount of time. Yep, sorry, Michael, I was ready to move on. Thank you. So in terms of the face mask material requirements, for example, if you look at the kind of equipment that's required, it's quite specific in terms of what it is that they'll be expecting for certain elements of it. Failure to meet them might result in the NHS just refusing, or the government refusing to take it on. So you have to make sure that you're very particular about the kind of materials that you're taking. There are deviations permitted potentially, but that must be authorised by a suitable authority. And it should show on the records who has authorised those changes, particularly if it's a change performed internally. This will lead me on to reworks when I go through that later, but effectively wherever we do not perform an operation in accordance with our documented process, or our typical process at least, then it needs to be clear why we haven't and who has authorised that has not affected the product quality. That may also need to accompany a risk assessment or similar to show that is the case. So inspection, test and delivery. So again, there has to be a way of demonstrating that conformity to acceptance criteria has been met by each individual batch, and that has to identify, specifically it has to identify who has authorised the product release, and that has to be maintained really in the batch records to show that all of the batch record was observed. So that may go all the way back to looking at the materials that were used, and following it all the way through the process, looking at the individual piece of documentation to make sure it's all there, and then the authorising authority states yes, it's all correct, and they send it off. Records have to identify the test equipment that was used to perform any measuring activities as well, so that it can be identified, that a specific piece of equipment was used to test it, so you can check that that specific equipment was it within any calibration that was needed, or any kind of maintenance and things like that. Where there's a need to service or to perform installation, instructions, if applicable, should also be provided. And the medical device and design technical file, and then the appropriate user training also needs to be collated and checked that the batch made conforms, and that any other information that's required to be sent to the user for its use is sent along with it. Non-conformances have to be well controlled, because there needs to be a way of effectively recalling and preventing use that could cause harm to patients or to users, in fairness as well. in order to make sure that there's a suitably adequate recall process, traceability and identification is key as part of it. There should be a documented process to manage NCR, but both found internally and externally, and positive segregation, so making sure that good and bad are well and clearly segregated and identified is a must-have, really. Rework is not so. Rework specifically doesn't always relate to when you have to do a minor adjustment to a part. So, for example, if you're working at a manual lathing machine and you've finished a couple of them, then you turn on and notice, oh, actually, I could do with taking a bit more off of that one. That wouldn't necessarily require rework, but where we've stated that part is okay to move on, it's gone into the process, and then we found that there's an issue further on in the process, that's where rework may need to be performed in a controlled manner. Basically, when that is the case, there has to be a documented process, approved and reviewed in the same manner as the original manufacturing process, i.e. with the same level of authorization. When that is done, testing and inspection has to be performed at least following the normal requirements to ensure that conformity is still achieved afterwards. And then the batch records need to include evidence that was done, who authorized it, and then who inspected it. So that's it from me. Back to Michael.
Okay, thank you. Tam, there was a couple of questions come up. I've forwarded them on to you, so I don't know if you can see those.
Excellent. Yeah, sure. I can go through those right now.
Yeah. I'll do this bit, and then that'll give you a chance to go over those. So there's 3 ways NQA can help you at the moment. We can transfer your certification from another certification body. We're currently doing this free of charge. We can do it all remotely, so there's minimal impact to yourselves, and you never lose any certification time on your certificate. It's a pure transfer of the certificate. So if you had another 2 years left on it, then we transfer it over and you still get another 2 years left on it. You do not lose any gaps in between the time at all. There's no additional costs that we levy onto that. And as I say, at the moment, it's all being done free of charge to help organisations. Maybe you need to move over. We give a lot of additional services, such as free online training. We've got a big back office support. We've got some highly technical auditors out there, and some of which specialise, such as Tam, in the medical industry, so they can offer you that additional support there. There's lots of free information online. There's lots of it you can see on the website. And there's a link there if you were interested in doing the transfer and getting a transfer quote. Quotes are free of charge, obviously, so come along, you can get a price comparison and see what NQA can offer you opposed to your current certification body. One of the things that some organisations aren't necessarily aware of is that your current scope of certification may not actually cover you for COVID-19 related activities. So your 9001 may be covering you for, let's just say, tool making, just for example. You're now producing manufactured parts for ventilators or anything like that, or your scope of certification will not cover you for those activities. So you can upgrade your scope to cover those. And again, we're doing that free of charge at the moment. We can do that, a lot of it remotely off-site. We'll need to see certain records and see your systems updated and processes like that. And it is an actual audit that you go through, but it's all done remotely, and it will just ensure that your certificate covers you for your activities, you're covered for everything that you do. And there's another link down there that you can see that we've discussed that openly on our website. And like I say, it's free of charge that we're doing the upgrade to your scope of certification at the moment. And then thirdly, there's ISO 13485, which I say is specifically for the medical devices certification. Uses ISO 9001 as the base, but with a lot of specific requirements added on top, most of which Tam has just highlighted to you. So if you feel that that's something that you could do, and it is something you're looking at offering as a longer term basis, then feel free to get a quotation, read more on our website. There's a lot of information out there. If you are ISO 9001 already, it can be integrated, your 13485 integrated with your 9001 certification. And as I said earlier, if you're AS9100 or in fact IATF, which is the automotive standard, the impact of those changes are minimal. And we do in fact have a number of clients who are AS certified for the aerospace and ISO 13485 for the medical. So their systems are very, very similar for both standards there. Did notice actually something I need to correct, which noticed that the medical device regulation has been pushed back by a year. So when I said it was May 2020, I meant to say it was May 2021. So apologies for that.
I did notice. Sorry, but I forgot. My apologies as well.
Yeah, no, I noticed that. Just I was saying it, and then I've got a message off of someone in her office reminding me. So you're quite right. So apologise for that. Have you managed to look over those questions, Christian? Sorry, Tam.
Yes, just answering at the moment. Thank you. If there's any more, please do feel free to send them through.
Okay, so you're going to respond by writing it. Okay. Are there any questions from anyone before we wrap up? You can put them on the system, just ask a question, or alternatively, you can email any questions to us. If you put down there, you can see info@nqa.com. If you want to put any questions through to there that we can't answer right now, we can get back to you. Jan, can you recommend some? Not sure what your question is there, Jan. Sorry, client-friendly publications on this process. Self-certification. Right, there's quite a few questions coming in. So what I'll do, I'll leave that open. We'll have all your contact details from when you registered, and then we'll send you a follow-up email. It'll probably be the easiest way, because they're only just coming in and will take us time to read them anyway. So we'll end the webinar there, but as I say, feel free, write any questions to info@nqa.com, and we'll be happy to respond to you through that process.